My first exposure to anarchism in literature was around 2001 when I bought the novel Salt in a used bookshop. I'm not saying it's a good book or a good introduction to anarchist thought, but it certainly had a lasting impact on my worldview. One that led to my tutor at school telling me I hadn't been picked for prefect because of my political views, which, as silly as it sounds, kind of made sense. Why give this young anarchist an arbitrary hierarchical position? I'm not saying this to establish my political street cred. I don't claim to be well versed in anarchism. I'm not here to talk politics. I'm here to talk about the artistry of RPGs. Games are art. This one especially so, and art is political, whether or not a game discusses it openly. And today's game does discuss it openly, so I will too. Zephyr, an anarchist game of fleeting identities. So, what is an anarchist game of fleeting identities? Well, let's set the scene before we get started. Somewhere on the endless salt flats, the wandering continent Ophoi walks in an inexorable journey. It breathes the Zephyr, alien feelings that combine to form familiar emotions. And on some evenings, as the Ophoi exhales a chaotic maelstrom of feelings, the masked windfolk leave wooden mannequins to be infused with the Zephyr, awakening into new windfolk, formed from the emotions of whatever mix of Zephyr happened to pass into them at that moment. This is a game about exploring this strange world on the back of the Ophoi. A game of deep lore and of conflict between the stateless windfolks on the edges of the Ophoi and the salt states in the centre. It's a unique game about survival, relationships, obligations and emotions, the fleeting identities of Zephyr. The game comes in a box. Inside the box is a book, a beautifully illustrated, atmospheric and high-quality hardback. The designer, Federico Sons, also illustrated the entire book in this evocative and moody style, where every page is a painting accompanied by text. And that text is masterful as well, with a conversational style that feels like Federico is personally telling you about their game, rather than the dispassionate technical writing or slightly removed fairy tale lore that we're used to. Also, inside the box are 2 reversible sheets for a total of 4 maps that is helpful to have on the table while playing. And finally, a set of tokens with a pouch for safekeeping. We'll get on to what the tokens are for, but for now I'll say that Zephyr doesn't use dice. It uses groups of tokens whose mixture of colours evoke the feelings of characters and their emotional bonds to the world. Sometimes a game pushes against the limitations of my usual review format so much that I want to rethink it entirely. So I'm going to do something slightly different this time and talk about the gameplay and mechanics together rather than separately, in more or less the order that the book does, because I think it's important to the way the mechanics evoke the themes of Zephyr. So let's start with creating a character, where the book guides you with these beautiful comic strips. You begin as inanimate wood carvings until you're infused with Zephyr. To do that, you take 8 tokens at random without looking. The tokens are cyan, yellow, magenta, and black, representing the complex alien feelings of the Ophoi, but in order are associated with ambivalence, passion, differentiation, and regulation. This is the mixture you were awakened with, the feelings that birthed you into one of 4 clans, the Wind Clan, who traverse the skies on gliders and help foster relationships between all the peoples on the periphery. The Frontier Clan, freedom fighters who protect the Windfolk from the violence of the Salt States. Moon Clan, a dependable and ancient clan descended from the Formless, a strange being whose body stretches miles through underground rivers. And the eyeless Earthen Folk, who are skeptical of some of the other Windfolk traditions and built the Great Bowing Citadel, a slanted city that becomes level for the weeks-long bowing season, where the Ophoi's breath flexes the entire continent. Sometime after you're awakened with Zephyr, clan elders will tell you some of the myths of the world, asking questions about how you want to interpret them, because Windfolk narratives are not owned or policed by any authority. And at this point, you can spend your tokens as different answers are associated with different feelings and grant different traits to your character. And what a beautiful, thematic and unique way of building your character, influenced by a combination of the feelings that birthed them, the traditions of their community, and their own personal choices and worldview they're encouraged to develop. And already I'm in love with this game. Beautiful, thematic, unique. And lastly, during the festivities, you'll take on an obligation, a deep and lasting bond with your community, one that will take you on a journey across the world and into adulthood. You can think of an obligation as a quest, if you like, but it's more than that, and I think it's important to understand that obligations are not things that you do in return for a reward. They're what tie people together. They represent your relationships and desire to socialize, help, or reciprocate. Having too many unfulfilled obligations takes an emotional toll on you. And that awkward feeling of unfulfilled obligation is called oi. And for the sake of the game, you can quantify how much oi certain training or items might cost, and build from that an obligation or task that's proportional to what you received. And once again, how thematic. We're so used to currency in RPGs, often gold, that I tend to shun in my games, as to me, gold brings to mind some of the worst crimes in human history. But here, Zephyr shows us other ways are possible. So once you have your first obligation, you start out on your adventure across Ophoi. You can use these maps to remind you of your location, which is useful because the 4 regions have their own associated Zephyr colour and weather patterns, infused with the breath of the Ophoi. The first thing you'll be doing in the session is checking the weather by drawing a colour for the season and another for the weather and checking against the region. Weather has various effects, one being to spawn Zephyr tokens for the region, and whenever you spend Zephyr, you give it to that region, perhaps placing it on the map. The world is infused with Zephyr, and so, remember, are you. In fact, you're somewhat made of Zephyr, so you have a constitution score comprised of your own Zephyr tokens. The main resolution mechanic is called a reveal, where when you're trying something risky, you secretly take a number of tokens from your constitution. The GM does the same, and you hold them in a fist. There's various things that can affect this process, but using the default difficulty, you both take between 1 and 3 tokens. If you open your hands and reveal the same number of tokens, you fail the check. If you each have a different number, you succeed. You might notice that if you're allowed to pick up more than 3, it makes the check easier, and if you reverse the outcome so that ties mean successes, it makes the check harder. You can, however, guarantee a success by evoking, spending 3 tokens of colours that represent an appropriate emotion and spend them into the region, creating or developing a bond. Now, all that probably sounds quite abstract at first, but it's actually something you'll see contained within your character. Let's use an example. While trekking the mountains, I need to make a dangerous climb that the narrator says will require a reveal. However, I have 2 yellows and a cyan in my constitution. For Wind Clan, that's fear. So I have an idea and might say, I'd like to evoke here. Perhaps a handhold crumbles and falls into the mist beneath me, but at the last second I catch myself and make it up with eyes wide and glowing with yellow and cyan. I'm going to add a bond of fear with high places. And now I have a Wind Clan character who's developing a fear of heights, which is an interesting concept. And since I exuded that fear, it gets added to the region. And as your constitution depletes, you become more unbalanced in your Zephyr and more vulnerable to various ailments. And how do you replenish your constitution? Well, eating, of course. Just as you're infused with Zephyr, so is the land and the creatures that roam it. Like all these strange and wonderful creatures you can hunt. You can also gather and even farm for cooking ingredients. And if you're not a big fan of survival mechanics, the storyteller section at the back explains how to make survival more or less prevalent in the game. So now you can go, fulfill your obligations, discover the super interesting mechanic of threads that tie abilities to your bonds, explore Offway, and learn about the varied peoples, cultures and land, and take a stand against the coercion of salt debt and the salt heroes that enforce it. I absolutely love the thematic and creative resolution system of Zephyr tokens and reveals, but it's not without its downsides. First, it's by no means insurmountable, but how to reveal is a problem you'll need to solve somehow if you're playing online. Second, it makes Zephyr a tricky game to play solo. It's not meant to be played solo, but it did mean that I wasn't able to play it myself yet, which is just as much a criticism of me as it is of the game. And third, the tokens in the box come with their own downsides. They seem to be repurposed rhinestones. The black tokens are black all over, but the cyan, magenta and yellow have these silver backs with facets that come to a point. And the coloured sides though have a flat surface, so they're very likely to come to rest on the wrong side and don't sit very nicely. They're also quite small, easily lost, and if, as the book suggests, you have snacks at the table and slightly oily hands, they're going to stick to your fingers and palm when you reveal, which just isn't quite as pleasant a sensory experience as rolling dice. Again, these are by no means insurmountable problems, and I imagine reviewers had similar complaints when D10s were invented. When I first started writing this conclusion, it was about Zephyr's place as an innovative work of art and the themes it tackles. But all that critic speak sounds so bland to me now, devoid of the hues of real emotion. Instead, I'll talk about the effect just reading Zephyr had on me personally. It captured me. It sucked me into a world that was so much deeper than I was expecting from a thematic story game. And if you've ever heard anyone go on about the lore of Dark Souls, that's how I feel about Zephyr 2. And that's why I didn't want to include an expandability section this time. It's far more expansive than I thought it would be. and the lore is just evocative enough to imply so much unwritten history and culture waiting for you to both explore and create at the table. I wanted to talk so much more in this review about the fascinating and weird concepts of the Stranger Kings, the mysterious ammonia, the Salt States and its heroes, but I had to restrain myself because I can only summarise what the book can say perfectly well for itself. It made me regretful that I didn't find a group to play the game with before I started writing, and made me more determined to try in the future. It made me reflect. It made me think more about my place in my community, the alienations and disconnects I feel from things that should be more important, and what my obligations are towards them, and help me think of concepts like debt and obligation in a more expansive way. It reminded me of real-world concepts like the prehistory of Neolithic tribes giving way to the warlords of Iron Age hill forts, and the disease, violence and suffering that came along with that ripples through history in stories of the exploitation of the have-nots by the haves. It inspired me. It inspired me to be bolder in my own world building, and on the occasions I design games or modules, to take more risks with fantastical ideas and concepts. It inspired me to learn new things and to really take on board a core lesson, which is, in games, as in politics, different ways are possible. I think about my obligations to the community a lot, and I hope I'm doing my part in bringing a little bit more of the RPG attention share towards smaller games that I guess could be bigger games. There's been quite a lot of chatter in the indie RPG scene in the last week about how skewed content creators are towards that one game. I was particularly sad to hear a designer talk about how they approached a large D&D YouTuber about a game that should have been right up their alley, but instead they asked for $600 to $800 to cover it, money that barely any indie designer can afford. My feeling is that Dungeons & Dragons might be super popular, but not in the disproportionate way that it seems on YouTube. And there's definitely an appetite and an opportunity right now for this scene of ours to grow and for people to play more games. And if you feel so inclined, one of the best things you can do is share around your favourite indie RPG creators, whether that's designers, actual plays, essayists, bloggers, whatever. Word of mouth is super important in the scene, and I know I'd like to hear about them. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and my eternal gratitude, as always, to this month's Ko-fi supporters for helping me on this journey of discovery. And until next time, happy adventures.